And now, two guys who once survived not taking a shower for a whole day. That's nasty. Aaron and Jonathan.
Howdy, and welcome to episode 48 of In the Rabbit Hole's Urban Survival Podcast. In this episode, we're joined by author John Heatherly, who lets us play with models and then reads us a survival bedtime story. We're your hosts, Aaron
and Jonathan,
and you are in the rabbit hole, safe and sound. Today's show is sponsored by Cat's Coffee. If you're looking for truly exceptional coffee to help you survive the morning or the next zombie apocalypse, you need to be drinking Cat's. They specialize in the finest coffee from sources that prioritize environmental responsibility and are fair trade certified. Their goal is to achieve perfection in every cup. Check them out at Cat's, K-A-T-Z as in zebra, coffee.com, or click on their bright green banner on the site and make sure you're dealing with an official sponsor of the show. Again, that's Cat's, K-A-T-Z as in zebra, coffee.com. Before we begin today, a quick thing I'd like to let everybody know. There was some audio issues that we were having on our end in the studio. There's also an issue that was happening with Jonathan's microphone and my chair. Jonathan's microphone, you end up hearing a little bit of him typing on the keyboard, and my chair sounds like somebody's passing gas. I assure you, nobody was passing gas during the show, at least not that you could hear. Anyway, with that, we'd like to introduce you to and bring on author John Heatherly, who we've mentioned quite a few times in the show. He is the author of the Survival Template, and he also has a new book coming out called The Medicine Symbol that we're going to get into today. And with that, let's get into it. Okay, so we're joined today by John Heatherly, author of The Survival Template, which we've talked about before, and also a new book coming out that we'll talk about in just a bit. But first, John, I'd like to welcome you to the show and thank you and your wife, as I recently found out, for service to your country.
Well, Aaron, you're welcome, and thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, I know Jonathan and I were both really excited to have you on, especially after, the Survival Template has become kind of a part of the show, really. I think we both kind of found a kinship in having similar messages.
Yeah, man. I like what you guys are doing on the forum, too, with the survival chi planning, and maybe you want to talk about that more in a little bit. But absolutely, as soon as I saw that resonated with a lot of the things that I'm trying to do as well.
Well, awesome. So for listeners that are not that familiar with your work and maybe who you are, can you kind of go into your background a little bit for us and how this all came about for you?
Sure. For me, I was a guy that always did pretty well in school academically. I made pretty good grades. I wasn't great at getting my hands dirty. And once I got out of school, I went into the military and discovered through survival training that there were some lessons there that I hadn't really picked up in school. And I had a problem that was kind of unique to me that I would call maybe a consistency problem. Sometimes at work I would do really, really well. Other times I would do not so well. And the frequency of my really good achievements and my really dumb or bad achievements was very close together. I was all over the place. And so I started looking at some of the things that I learned in the survival to try to even that out a little bit, or to try to have a little bit of consistency. And eventually, more recently, my son was born. So I wrote the book, The Survival Template, to sort of document some of these things that had worked for me and it helped me to exceed, at least improve my success rate. And honestly, I hope my son reads it when he's older and can avoid maybe some of the mistakes that I made along the way.
How has having a child really kind of affected your life and maybe your survival planning?
Yeah, that's the thing. I talk to the people in the survival community a lot, and they say, they're buying more guns or they're buying ammo and they're worried about preparation. And it is true, for a single guy, there's a lot less to worry about. Maybe if you have a backpack full of gear or a firearms collection or something like that, that's all the thoughts of preparation you might give. But with a family, of course, I think through what ifs, how will I take care of my son if some of these things, if we have a natural disaster like another hurricane in Florida or something like that. But mostly, I wanted to write the book just to kind of give a guideline for some ways to get his own thoughts in order and to maximize his own capabilities.
Well, very cool. So to kind of back up for a minute, I was reading someplace that you actually did take some survival courses and stuff. Was that through Tom Brown? Was that before you went into the military, or was that after you went into the military?
Yes, when I was in college, I went to Tom Brown's tracker school and very much enjoyed it. And of course, as far as I'm concerned, when you're talking primitive survival skills, Tom Brown is probably the best there is. And so I had a lot of real eye-opening experiences there and knew that I wanted to continue studying survival, and ended up doing a little bit more of that in the military over the years.
Oh, well, very cool. So I guess, that's kind of interesting. Tell us a little bit more as far as, since a lot of your work is more around mentality and attitude and stuff like that, what did you take away from Tom Brown's school, and kind of how has that shaped you going forward a little bit?
Tom Brown he teaches a lot of old, more Native American style survival. And what I found from that, especially in light of what I learned in the military later on, it's all very objective oriented. For example, one of the first things Tom Brown teaches is the sacred order of survival, or shelter, water, fire, and food. So, people come up to me all the time and ask me tips about survival, or they ask me my opinion on this or that. And many times I find myself quoting that sacred order just because it's so effective. Shelter, water, fire, food. And for a Native American, that order was something that you really didn't mess with. It was to be followed as a matter of priority.
And John, we talked about it a little off the air before we started the show, but that whole idea of that objective-based survival has filtered into your everyday life as well. So,
right.
We did those survival chi plans. Can you tell us a little bit about how that works for you?
Yes, certainly. Well, like I said early on, I had kind of a consistency problem, and I really think a lot of that was just a lack of focus on my part. Some of that comes with maturity. Much of this mindset got started for me actually on a military training trip. I was put out on a solo exercise in the winter where I had to spend a few days by myself out in the woods with objectives to achieve. And as I was sort of setting off on my own, the instructor said, "Hey, look, I've noticed about you guys that you're more likely to be successful and to get these things done if you write down your objectives. So my advice to you before you go off and do this is to take out your little journal or your tactical paper, whatever you've got, and really think about your objectives before you start doing things." And that was sort of the genesis of my philosophy, and really the genesis of the survival template.
Well, that's really neat. So how long, I guess, did you work on the survival template before you got it out, or how long was it kind of sitting and simmering in the back of your mind?
I started back in the 90s using some of the ideas, and I eventually started buying these little leather journals to sort of tinker with different ideas or different projects that I had going. So I had practiced this for over 10 years, just in small ways, and I found that it was simple but very effective. And then it just kind of occurred to me after my son was born in 2010 that I really needed to write this down because it had worked so well for me, whether I was going through a good time in life or a dark time, that the concepts worked for me, and so I wanted to share them with other people.
Well, that's awesome, and I got to say personally, I'm really glad you did. I found, as I was reading it, I really quickly realized it was a far departure from most of the survival books that are out there, in that it focused on planning, organization, and being mentally oriented in your survival topics instead of, you need to have 3 months worth of food, or you need to have 7 days worth of water, and you need to go get this and do that. Instead, and we had the planning and objectives and all that, the survival chief planning series a little while back, and much in the same way, It was very much like, yeah, it's great to know that maybe you need to do these things, but to go forward without a plan of how you're going to get them done or in what time frame, and then they just become this kind of nebulous idea that, oh, well, I need to get 7 days or 3 months worth of food. And it just kind of hovers out there. And you did such a great job of really boiling it down into these are the steps to take in planning. And I guess at what point did you finally decide, you know what, I need to really put this on paper and I need to get this out there?
The actual time frame was around March and April of last year. And I wrote the book pretty quickly because most of the techniques are something I practice. And honestly, what I found is that if I incorporate these ideas every single day or, as part of my normal routine, I don't want to say I'm sitting making a list all day, every day, because I'm not. However, if I keep track of that mentality and give it some attention occasionally, I have found when I need to speed up my thinking or something flat goes wrong or I need to solve a problem, I sort of kick into that mode a little bit more efficiently, and I think it's just from habit. So I started in 2010 with that and didn't take long to write the book. And now, it's interesting. I'm dealing with people all the time that say, oh, wow, some of these ideas are so simple. And they tell me how they tried it out with a project or a problem they're having, and it works for them too. So it's all about kind of fast, even though I had worked on it for many years.
Mm-hmm. So John, it's interesting you brought up the idea of it was just habit, so it was easy. Because I think that's a huge part of this planning. And I guess the real question here is, when you're talking about this and bringing it all together, what's the overarching philosophy around why you feel attitude, planning, they're so crucial to survival?
Occasionally you'll hear a survival story, and there's a couple of really good ones out there. One guy was stranded in his car on a snowy pass. Another guy was stranded up north in Alaska. He had to set his airplane down. And you hear about these guys that the evidence shows they find themselves in this supposedly bad situation, and then they give up. Suicide would be the worst case scenario. And in fact, the two stories I just described, I think that's what happened. Mm-hmm. But some people, because they just, for whatever reason, they haven't thought about the situation in advance or they don't have a set of objectives, just give up immediately. And, of course, that's the deal breaker for them. And I believe having preset objectives on one set of circumstances can help you when circumstances change, and you have to go out and consider a new problem.
You touched on was a topic that you talked about in the book a little bit when you were talking about the Stockdale Paradox and that optimism alone is not enough to get through a situation. Can you kind of go into that a little bit? I mean, optimism is obviously important, and we talked a little bit before the show that you're an optimist, but in a survival situation, what role does that play?
Sure. And the Stockdale Paradox came from an interview that Admiral Stockdale did with an author named Jim Collins. He wrote the book Good to Great. But in it, Collins asked Stockdale, who are the guys who didn't make it out of captivity and what happened? And he says, we had optimists who believed they would be home by Thanksgiving, or they would be home by Christmas, or they would be home by New Year's. And when that didn't happen, they just gave up. So the Stockdale Paradox is where Admiral Stockdale he had his long-term goal of course, being released from captivity and coming home, but he had rather serious and dire conditions to deal with in between. So he chose to effectively focus on both of those, long-term and then short-term solutions, so that he wouldn't become one of those optimists who ended up giving up early.
Very interesting. So I guess that's something that's really, I think, important is not... is holding on to that optimism that, things will be okay. And I think ultimately survivalists in general are by nature optimists, and which seems a little counterintuitive in that, most of us are preparing and planning, and ultimately the idea is that perhaps something will happen that we are preparing for. But in many ways, it's optimism that we can impress our own will upon situations and go forward, but not, I guess the lesson to take away from that is not overly optimistic to the point of creating false hope within yourself.
Maybe it's because as people mature and get into survival and preparation and some of these hobbies that you and I are interested in, they start realizing that the focuses or the things they focused on as youth probably weren't that important anyway. Mm-hmm. If you want to call it the MTV generation, well, you and I were probably that way. Back when you were in high school and college, I'm sure that there were properties you had back then that you think were silly now.
Oh, yeah.
And so really, survival just it's a way to study reality, I guess. And really that it kind of makes you an optimist once you realize a lot of those more petty concerns you had back then were really just not that important.
Yeah, and John, one of the things that I've really thought about a lot, and I know Aaron has too, is really this whole idea of self-sufficiency makes you more optimistic in the sense that when you can do it for yourself, then
right.
You can get it. You can get it done. It's always one of the issues that I had with the 7 Habits. It was that whole idea of not worrying about the things that are outside of your influence. And I used to always, I say often, even now, those are the things I worry about most. I have to because they're outside of my influence. If it's in my sphere of influence, I don't have to worry about it. I know I'll get it done. So
right, of course.
I always thought that was really interesting. But that idea of survival being based on that optimism, not necessarily the hopeful aspect of I'll be home by Christmas, but the optimistic idea of I will survive. I'll make it. I'll get through this. And, one of the things that you've talked about is this idea of object-oriented mentality. And can you explain that a little bit and what its significance is?
Yeah, and, sort of in light of our conversation just a few minutes ago, it's almost like this study of survival. Once you really start paying attention to it, you realize solutions exist, unlike those 2 guys that kind of gave up in the very beginning. Maybe if you're growing up in normal middle-class America and really thinking about a lot of these more serious issues, you may not even realize that, that there's reason to be optimistic. But the self-reliant person who starts looking into this stuff realizes that solutions exist to most problems. And really the limiting factor is probably in your own mind to begin with.
That was actually a really good, succinct answer to the question. The other thing you mentioned is crucible experience. I think a lot of us can relate to it. You did a really good job of bringing it out. It's, bringing it into words. Can you go into that a little bit for the listeners who both have and haven't read the
Yeah, sure. My early experiences with that were with, for example, the skill of firecraft. When we were learning how to build fires, and this is a military training course, we're learning how to build fires, and occasionally we would have a contest called the Man in the Creek contest. And basically that means whenever an instructor says the words man in the creek, you put down what you're doing and start building a fire as fast as you can, as if someone had fallen in the creek in the winter and we're going hypothermic. And the whole contest was to see who could get a knee-high fire going the fastest. So we do countless numbers of these man in the creek exercises and hone our skills and get a lot better. And one day we're training near a glacier-fed river, and we're all made to get in the river and then kind of lay down in the river and stay there. And after a few minutes of shivering, one of the instructors comes up and says, man in the creek. And so the crucible, if you will, is, in this case, the person who was hypothermic was me, and of course all the other trainees. And at that point, the man in the creek contest took on new meaning. It became more real for us because we had to perform all those skills we had practiced while under the pressure of feeling hypothermic.
That I got to say, when I was reading that, I was genuinely jealous, and maybe it's a masochistic kind of jealousy where I was like, oh my God, that sounds fantastic. I mean,
that's clearly masochistic.
Well, yeah. but what an awesome way to really drive those principles home and to hone those skills. And I think in many ways that's why it's so important to practice these skills instead of just academically reading about them, to fully engage with them and understand how they work and what they're really like.
I agree completely. And the thing about it is, Aaron, sure, the skill of firecraft is one that was on display during that particular exercise. But to back up, the real skill that came from it was the objective setting knowledge that if you have this problem, this hypothermia, you can fix it. There's a solution available. And I think for me, had I not practiced and had I not had a little bit of training, I probably just would have given up in the very beginning. As soon as I met with that challenge, that helpless feeling of there's nothing I can do, and then the situation just kind of degrades from there. Mm-hmm. So there's a couple of skills that happen there, the mental one and then the actual fire building one.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and John, Aaron brought it up earlier. I mean, one of the reasons we see such a such a closeness in the philosophies is that when you talk about skills, it's the same way we do, which is it's mental growth. It's understanding how to get through things, having the talent to do it and the skill to do it, rather than just hoping that the 10,000 rounds of ammunition that you stockpiled are going to somehow keep you alive.
Right, absolutely. And many times people underestimate themselves, and they give up. They give up before even trying because maybe they haven't thought through all this stuff. So, like for me, when I was writing the survival template, I wanted it to be short and concise, and maybe just open the possibility for people like my son to think, maybe I can do a little bit more or a little bit better, or I can achieve more than I thought, had I not considered it.
It's interesting that you say that way, because last week, Aaron and I took a class in knife sharpening and knife care. And one of the things the guy leading the class, who's Bob Kramer, a master bladesmith, said was, it's only hard because you haven't done it before. And I think that's the same thing with skills or underestimating yourself. A lot of these things are only difficult because you haven't practiced it, you haven't done it. If you actually went out there and did it and tried it and learned how to do it, all of a sudden it's not difficult to do.
I agree, and I think a lot of the people that we grow up kind of idolizing who have these amazing skills, I mean, not to take away from the things they do, but it's also true that an expert in the field has probably been practicing for a long time if they have work ethic. And so that's not to say that those people are any better than me or you. They're more familiar with the skills that they practice.
Right.
Yeah, and it's, and I think that's a thing to really appreciate the amount of effort and the work ethic that went into it. And I'll have to put it in the show notes. I can't remember who it was, but there was an author and I believe he was a psychologist that did a whole long study of how long it takes somebody to be what in society we consider an expert on a topic. And I think he said it was 10,000 hours of genuine input and interaction with whatever the skill was to truly master it. And so I think that's, and in a way that's very daunting, but at the same time, if you think about it, and you much in the same way you talk about in the survival template and we talk about in the show, as long as you stick with it, you'll get there. And it's just enjoy the journey and stop worrying about the destination so much.
Oh, well, what you said is completely true. And it kind of leads to something else that I'm interested in, and that's models and templates. For example, we're talking about experts now. Let's say someone has a better skill set than I have in a given endeavor. I found one of the best ways to get started if I don't really know what I'm doing, and I learned this from an instructor in the military, is to pick somebody and just emulate them in every way that you can. And I've always just interpreted that to mean emulate their mentality, emulate the things that are important to them. And I found that it makes the learning of a new skill or a new discipline a lot easier.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I think we can all kind of identify with that in our lives at some point that we had somebody that we really admired and we took on, hopefully, and it was hopefully a productive experience. I think if you're not careful, it can be an unproductive experience, but modeling ourselves after somebody that we admire that has greatness within themselves or has achieved some level of greatness in a particular thing that we're looking for.
And that's why we push so heavily on the networking concept. It's that go out there and find the people who can help you and that you can help. Don't just go out there and ask for something. Bring something to the table as well. But go out there, find those mentors, and really, help allow other people to help you grow.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I agree. And one thing that's helped me, if I can, is to document some of these models or these mental models. If I'm emulating a person or an expert, if I document what I'm trying to do and the things that are important to them, it helps me to consider the issue. And it makes it more real and a little bit easier for me to understand.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah. That's so on par with your book, The Survival Template, as far as writing things down, thinking them through and making them concrete, as opposed to just letting them be this kind of nebulous idea swirling around in the back of your mind that maybe ferments into something interesting and then again maybe doesn't if you don't apply a little pressure and actual effort to it. But that's really neat that you do that, and that to kind of go back for a little bit and maybe go into depth a little bit more about the survival template. And you talked a little bit about how it kind of helped you in your life, but can you kind of elaborate for us how how those principles, as you were developing them over that 10-year period of time, how they, maybe individual examples of how they really kind of made a difference in your life.
Well, we've talked some about just the survival skills, whether it's fire building or the sacred order, shelter, water, fire, and food. And early on for me, all these ideas weren't necessarily connected together. I might have a skill set I was looking at or a concept here and there. They weren't fluid. And as I got a little bit older and started having problems in life, the kind of thing that everybody has, whether it's frustrations at work or family problems or relationship problems, normal things that happen to most people, I started realizing that if I could connect some of these concepts together, I could come up with a system or a personal system for me of managing these problems better than maybe I could have, had I not thought about it. So it went from being just sort of a set of unrelated ideas to actually more of a fluid system of considering problems and considering objectives. And that's kind of how the survival template came about.
Speaking of implementing these principles and being productive in life, you've got a new book that's coming out that I had the pleasure of seeing in advance of, and it was a really interesting book. Can you tell us a little bit about it?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, and thanks for reading it. I really appreciate it. But I had a lot of fun with the book. It's called The Medicine Symbol. And originally, I was going to sit down and write another book that kind of deals with this concept of mental models or templates, much like the survival template. And in the survival template, I look at the mental model of a wilderness survivor, for example, or a prisoner of war. And so what I wanted to do with the second little ebook was just take that idea a step further and look at a new mental model. And once I got started on it, I felt this story might be told in a better way using some fiction. So really the first half of the book is a fictitious story of a survivor. And he kind of explores this mental model that I went on to write about. And I explain a little bit of it in the end. And I had so much fun. I got so engrossed in the story that I think I'm going to keep it going. So right now I'm working on the next installments or the next chapters of the fiction and really having fun with it. But I'm glad you enjoyed it, man. That's awesome.
Yeah, it was a very, and admittedly it was unexpected. I think after the survival template being so literal in so many ways, as opposed to the fiction piece that you've now produced, it was a very interesting departure. I was a little jarred at first because I wasn't expecting it, but it was very pleasurable. Can you kind of tell us a little bit about the story and what the book is a little bit about? Sure.
And, the idea that kind of came to me as I was working on it is a quote from Stephen King, and that is, fiction is the truth within the lie. Meaning, every good work of fiction has got some examples of truth that you might be able to use. And so I wanted to write the book that used a mental model based on the medicine wheels, or the Native American concept of a medicine wheel. And, archaeologists and anthropologists find them, and they theorize that they were calendars used to study the constellations, and I'm sure there's some truth to that. Lots of people have religious or spiritual meaning that they assign to medicine wheels, and I think all that stuff is awesome, although that's not really what I'm doing in this book. For me, I just wanted to write about the medicine wheels, using them as a mental model or a template based on the ideas of one of my favorite authors, who's a guy named Storm. He wrote Lightning Bolt, he wrote Seven Arrows, but again, lots of awesome stuff out there in the world of anthropology on medicine. What I wanted to do with my story was just focus on the mental model that they've come to embody. And the story does a pretty good job of that. And hopefully people find it exciting too, because it's not just, humdrum nonfiction. It's actually got a plot that you can get involved in while you consider some of these issues.
Mm-hmm. So where did you gain inspiration for this story, really?
Wow, I would probably have to answer that by saying a number of places. Like, I read lots of books. When I was a kid, I would read a lot of the survival stories by Louis L'Amour, who is also known for writing Westerns. I mentioned the author Storm. I read lots of his books. I've read all of Tom Brown's books over the years. So, maybe what I'm working on right now is kind of a combination of all those guys.
Mm-hmm.
there's fiction there. There's a little bit of how to. There's some suspense and all the things you find with fiction. But to answer your question, I think it's a combination of a lot of those authors that I read growing up.
Well, that's awesome, and I think so much of everything we do is really a culmination of our life's experiences. You know, we've talked a lot about mental models, and we've talked a lot about all these different concepts. But how would the readers really start practicing some of these concepts?
What I would recommend is getting a notebook or a leather journal. And I know you guys are big on the 7 Habits series. Same kind of thing there. You could use one of their journals. For me, I find I'm more likely to look at a leather journal or a list of objectives if it's in something nice looking. So I get the more rustic leather journals that you see. And then like I talk about in survival, start outlining things that are important to me. And there is a system to it, but for somebody who is just getting started, I'd recommend getting a notebook or a journal and start writing down some of their ideas so that they can study it over time and eventually start learning about themselves.
So, John, what are you working on now?
Well, I'm working on the next chapters of the story that started with the medicine symbol, and hope to have that out within the next few months. We'll see how that goes, because the story sometimes it takes on a life of its own, and I'm having a lot of fun with it. So next up will be chapters continuing story of the medicine symbol. I'm considering doing a companion to the survival template, but I want to make sure that I do that in such a way that I don't add to or complicate the simplicity of the survival template. Because just because an idea is simple doesn't mean that it's not more effective. And it's the kind of thing where I don't want to subtract from it by adding to it, if that makes sense.
Oh, yeah, that makes perfect sense.
And John, in the spirit of Archie planning and such, what do you have planned for the future for yourself? What do you want to learn next? What's on your list?
Well, actually, in the survival realm, I really want to learn more of the more modern, what you might call tactical skills. For example, I know guys who know how to pick locks, and I never, for many years, considered that as being a skill that I might want to have. But besides being cool, no, that might be the kind of thing I would need to do someday.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I'm not talking about picking a lock to break into something.
No,
but,
of course not.
You hear stories of these guys in the military or who are kidnapped or captured overseas. Those kind of people need those skills. Same thing with handcuffs, for example. If I knew how to get out of a set of handcuffs, that would be a pretty cool and fun skill to practice. So I kind of like to develop my skill set in those areas over the next few months.
Neat. Really neat.
Yeah, I know. I picked up, that was one of the first skills I picked up. Oddly, in many ways, I think Jonathan and I have done things a little bit out of order.
Of course we have.
Of course we have. But it was one of the first skills I picked up, and at the time, I was very fortunate to have someone that I could directly learn from, who was a locksmith, and that was his specialty, was cracking safes and cracking locks and stuff. And so I got a bit of an education from him, and it's been amazing. You don't really, and it's kind of like, we talk about a lot about people carrying pocket knives again, and, how you don't realize how useful they are until you start carrying them. And it was kind of the same thing with lockpicking. It was one of those skills where you'll never realize just how useful it is until all of a sudden you have it. And then it's, oh yeah, okay, fine. We lost the keys to the garage, or we lost the keys to some padlock. And it's, oh, well, let me just get my lockpicks. Or, if you learn it well enough, and you can then improvise lockpicks and open it up. So it really, not to stay away from the nefarious side of things, just in everyday life, when we lose our keys or when we have just something and it's like, I'll just pick it. And it just becomes this useful skill that you stop thinking about even having. It's just there and available for you. And it becomes such a convenience when the need arises.
Is there a book or something you can recommend to a guy like me who's just getting started out with that skill set?
There is some stuff off the top of my head. I don't remember what the names of the books and videos and stuff that I looked up. I know there's a ton of stuff on YouTube, and I'll put it in the show notes as well. And there was also an article, and I think it was one of the very first articles for this for the blog that I wrote, and it was about the usefulness of lock picking. But I'll definitely put it in the show notes, and I'll also email it directly to you, so you can kind of get it. There's some really great free information on the web about it.
Yeah, and John, one of the things I found, because Aaron got a lot further into it than I did, but I mean, I've even used it. I had a box that I had a small master lock on, and I lost the key years ago, and I was able to use the skill just to get into the box, my own box. But one of the things I found the most useful was, I think, Aaron, I think you're the one who lent it to me, was a small lock. And just, I had a simple 2-pick set, just the 2-piece set, and played with that for a long time until I could do it. Because it's all about feel. The videos were great because they give you a general idea. But with lockpicking, it was much more about the feel and the way it worked and actually doing it than it was watching something.
Yeah, the watching the videos and stuff just gives you a mental picture, and then as you're playing with the locks, it gives you something to kind of picture in your head, and you start to put the sensations that you're getting from being in the lock and working with the lock. You're starting to actually put it together. Okay, when I'm touching this, that must be this from what I've seen from the video, from the illustrations and stuff. And so you start to gain a better understanding and learning to, I guess the best way to put it is, see the internals of the lock through your hands instead of seeing it with your eyes.
Wow. I'm envisioning an interesting conversation. Like, people ask me why I wrote the survival template. It's really easy to say, well, I wrote it for my son because I want him to learn from it. If I pick up the skill of lock picking, I'm not going to say, oh, I'm learning this, I can pass it on to my son. A non-survival minded person may not understand that the way you and I do.
Yeah.
But that's great, man.
So, John, you've made a very gracious offer to the listeners to, well, you know what? I'll let you tell them about it.
Yeah, sure. Maybe I can just start a thread there in the rabbit hole on the forum talking about the medicine symbol, and people who are interested in taking a look can just answer in the thread there, and I can send out to them, the Kindle version, the iPad version, or even a PDF for people that don't have e-readers, and we can start a discussion there. And then maybe after a few weeks, once people have had time to read the information, we can talk about it right there on the forum, and it may turn into more of an ongoing thing. Does that sound good to you guys?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, that sounds great.
Yeah, man, I'd love to do something like that. And I love talking to people about this stuff because I found that, that people always bring up things that maybe I hadn't thought of, or a different way of looking at it, or a better way of looking at it, and it helps me to learn too. So I'll get with you guys a little bit after the show, and I can put a thread out there, and we can just start right there.
Awesome. That would be fantastic, and I know our listeners would be really jazzed about it.
Yeah, great. Well, thanks for the opportunity. That's going to be really cool.
No, yeah, John, thank you. I think anything that we can do to spark more conversation about these topics and get people really thinking about it helps us and, helps them too. So we love it.
Great. Thank you.
Thanks again to author John Heatherly for joining us on the show. And to everybody else, we hope you have a Merry Christmas. I know we're going to have the Christmas holidays here before we see each other again. And for those that don't celebrate Christmas, well, we'll see you at the Chinese restaurant. And with that, we wrap up episode 48. Thank you for joining us. If you liked the podcast, make sure to leave us a review in iTunes. It helps others find us. And if you didn't, well, why not tell us about it using the contact form on the site? Seriously, the show's for you, the listener. And if you have something to say, we're listening. Be sure to connect with us through Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and the Urban Survival Forum through the links on the top right-hand side of the site at www.intherabbithole.com. Also, don't forget to sign up for the newsletter. By connecting with us, you'll receive updates about the site, notifications of new articles, and podcast episodes. That's right, we're not just a podcast. Every week, articles are posted to the site that cover all manner of topics relating to surviving in an urban environment, whether in good times or in extreme circumstances. Show notes are posted with each episode where we invite you to comment on the show, interact with us, interact with each other, and let the world know what you're thinking. From the Lone Star State, until next time, stay safe and sound.